From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. The footage lasts for less than a minute. We have a bird's eye view sweeping across scenes of utter devastation. Piles of rubble, buildings that no longer have walls, just floors of dust and debris. And a few reminders of the homes that once existed here, the odd mirror somehow still clinging to a wall. As the drone zooms in closer, we see two dusty armchairs facing one another. One is empty, and in the other, with his back to the camera, is the lone figure of a fighter, covered in dust, his face shrouded in a Palestinian scarf, his right arm clearly injured. As the drone hovers closer, he reaches down with his left arm and hurls a broken bit of wood at the drone. A final act of defiance before the screen goes dark. The death of the Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, should have been a decisive victory for Israel, but the battle of the narratives sparked by that footage is still raging.
He told you he was a lion, but in reality, he was hiding on a dark den, and he was killed when he fled in a panic from our soldiers.
Surprisingly, Sinwar was not hiding in a tunnel and not shielded by hostages. For many Palestinians, though certainly not all, he's now a martyr.
With Israel's most wanted man dead and the leadership of Hamas wiped out, across the world, leaders saw this as an opportunity to end the war.
Hamas is decimated and its leadership is eliminated. This moment gives us an opportunity to finally end the war in Gaza. And it must end.
We must make the most of this moment. What is needed now is a ceasefire in Gaza, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, immediate access for humanitarian aid, and a return to the path towards the two-state solution.
But in the days that followed, the bombing has continued in Gaza, with no sign of the war ending. With Yahya Sinwar now dead, where does it leave Hamas, the Palestinians, and the war? And what is Benjamin Netanyahu's end game? The story today, what the death of the leader of Hamas means for Gaza.
My name is George Grylls. I am defence correspondent for The Times. I am currently in Tel Aviv.
George, there's been some very dramatic images coming out of the Israeli government in the last 24 hours or so, starting to show a bit more of Yahya Sinwar's life in the run-up to his death over the last year. In particular, we've suddenly seen images of a bunker that he inhabited.
We are declassifying footage of Sinwar from just a few hours before the October 7th massacre, as well as his movements inside Gaza as he fled over the past year.
Just describe for us what the images show.
So we can start to kind of put together a picture of what Yahya Sinwar's life was like since October the 7th. And it really starts actually before all those Hamas militants stormed across the border and committed the massacre and those sort of historical events that we've come to know so well. On the night before, on October the 6th, roughly about 11 p.m. until 1 a.m., Yahya Sinwar was ferrying supplies down into the tunnels underneath Gaza in apparent knowledge of what was about to happen and that there would be a huge Israeli response. And he basically needed to get him and his family comfortable. So we see among the goods, along with kind of water bottles and pillows, he actually carries down what appears to be a plasma TV screen with his son. His sons are kind of wearing these football shirts. His wife is carrying a handbag. The Israelis claim it may be a Hermes handbag, which is worth £25,000. Some internet sleuths have kind of disputed that. But it kind of builds up a picture of this kind of, I mean, not exactly luxurious lifestyle because you're still living in a tunnel, but it's certainly a comfier surroundings that Yahya Sinwar is building for himself than that afforded to the Palestinians on the surface, who many of whom don't know what's about to happen and are going to face, well, now a year of bombardment.
And you say not luxurious, but comfier than a lot of the people above the ground. Just describe what that lair, the bunker, looks like.
Well, the next footage Israel has released is what they claim is Sinwar's bunker itself in Khan Yunis, which is his hometown. And it's almost like an apartment. It has all the trappings of kind of normal life. It's got a tiled bathroom, with a shower gels, hot water, shampoo. He's also got a kitchen. Bear in mind that parts of Gaza that's been a struggle to get food, it seems to be pretty well stocked by comparison. There's a safe with absolute wads of cash. So it's a bunker that doesn't really bear any resemblance to the kind of those images you might see of displaced Palestinians in tents and everything on the surface. Obviously, this is what Israel said Sinwar was using, and there is a reason why they have released this footage now.
Well, that's interesting. Just tell us why we're suddenly seeing one of these images now, because it does seem like they've had the images of the bunker for a while.
So I think we've got to cast our minds back to last week and what happened with Sinwar's death itself. Now, the Israelis appear to have dropped the ball, really. Their soldiers took pictures of Sinwar after they kind of identified him. There was this kind of day-long battle, basically. Eventually they got there, realised by accident they'd killed the man they were all looking for. And the images are pretty gruesome. But what they show is Sinwar above ground, crucially. He's wearing a keffiyeh, which is like a sort of Palestinian traditional scarf. And he seems to be, in his death throes, battling to the last. He looks defiant. And this as an image is very resonant in the Middle East and creates the impression that far from being this kind of coward who was hiding away in tunnels below Gaza, he was in fact a martyr who was taking the fight to Israel to the very last. And then they released, similarly, this kind of footage from a drone showing him trying to, clearly severely wounded in his right arm, with this kind of last gesture, trying to down this drone by throwing a stick in a rather feeble fashion. Again, that gives the impression of someone who doesn't give up, who wants to fight to the end.
There's sort of been a battle of narratives over those images. They seem to have played out differently in different places.
Yeah, I mean, to some Palestinians, to parts of the Middle East, to an Arab audience, perhaps more than an Israeli one, this discredits the Israeli narrative throughout the war, which is that he's been buried in a bunker surrounded by hostages and allowing his compatriots to all die by their tens of thousands above him. So what the Israelis have done since is released all this footage that they have kind of accrued over the past year to try and dispel that and try and get back to the idea of Sinwar and how he was living before he kind of emerged from the tunnels in Rafah, where he was eventually killed.
Right, so in some parts of the Arab world you have this image of this being quite a heroic end. He's fighting until the end, he's facing the battle, he's on the front line. How much do these images discredit that? How will it be playing out, the images of a, not luxurious, but certainly more comfortable den underground?
I think the problem for the Israelis is that first impressions count, don't they? I mean, we both work in news. We know that the narrative is set within those first minutes, if not seconds, of an event happening. And the defining images of Sinwar will be his last stand, I think, more so than him collecting the plasma screen and going down into the tunnels. That's the danger for the Israelis. So regardless of the fact that prior to his flight to Rafah, where he was basically forced as the Israeli clearing operations worked their way down through Gaza, and eventually he ran out of tunnel to hide in, The problem is that that's a powerful image of him fighting back. And it's noticeable, for example, that the house where he died, the Israelis already have plans to demolish it because they fear it's going to become something of a pilgrimage site, a shrine to his martyrdom.
Well, we'll come on to his flight to Rafah in a moment. Before we do, though, clearly he spent some time in that den, in the bunker underground. Do we know how that period ended and how he ended up above ground? Do we know what happened to him during the course of that year?
Well, the Israelis claim that they came basically within minutes of catching him there. They say that when they descended into that bunker, the coffee on the table was still warm. What happened was that the Israelis basically progressed south through the Gaza Strip, and in the winter, the end of last year, beginning of this year, they entered Khan Yunis, which they knew was Sinwar's hometown, and they started destroying the tunnel infrastructure there. The Israelis claim that it was at this moment that he realised that he couldn't get out of there and that they needed to find a new plan. And that's when the Israelis claim he went down to Rafah. The next clue isn't until August, really, which is when the Israelis made a pretty horrifying discovery, which was the bodies of 6 hostages who had gunshot wounds that were kind of consistent with them being executed at point-blank range. And they say that they found in the same tunnel complex, not the same tunnel itself, but nearby, a headquarters that, again, Sinwar might have used in Rafah. And they said they found traces of his DNA actually in urine that they found there. Now, again, that leaves a big gap between him leaving Khan Yunis and, they say, him being in a tunnel in Rafah. And it's also debatable the extent to which the Israelis themselves had confidence in this intelligence, because if Israel's most wanted man, they can pinpoint him to a certain area, I think you would have expected them to flood Rafah with special forces and to throw every single resource at trying to get him. This is a major war aim, assassinating Sinwar, and they didn't really do that. And in fact, Sinwar was killed by basically a trainee battalion.
Tell us about that. What do we know about the day? What do we know about what exactly happened to Yahya Sinwar?
So there is the Bislach Brigade, which is a kind of trainee brigade. In wartime, that these soldiers are going to get mobilized, but they're basically still learning the ropes, still training. And they were the ones who were kind of entrusted with this clearing operation in Rafah. Actually, Israel had declared that the battle for Rafah had been won, that they destroyed the Hamas tunnels there. The main reason why they got into Rafah was to close off the tunnels under the Philadelphia corridor, which connect Gaza to Egypt, which they said Hamas was using to smuggle. Actually, by September, they said, we'd done that. And they thought that basically the remaining job was clearing the booby-trapped buildings and destroying a few more tunnels that they'd already kind of sussed out. And they thought that could be entrusted basically to pretty regular infantry. So on October the 16th, these trainee soldiers basically spot some suspicious movement. And what they see are 3 men clearly trying not to be seen, skulking through Tel Al Sultan, which is this suburb of Rafah. And the front 2 people are wrapped in blankets. And they say that's a typical sign that they're trying to disguise what they're up to. They're trying to avoid detection. And so basically a firefight breaks out. And this is kind of late morning, around noon. And what happens in this ensuing battle is that the 2 leading figures, who are actually Sinwar's bodyguards, get split up from him. He's trailing. The idea being that, they attract the fire. And he goes off into one building and they go off into another. Then the Israeli troops for the next several hours basically engage the 2 who are basically returning the fire, who are the bodyguards. And after a battle lasting a couple of hours, several hours, they get killed. So by this point, the Israelis turn their attention to this mysterious man who has basically fled to a residential building. He's gone up to the first floor of it, and they kind of know he's injured. They think he's taken some injury in his arm, and they send up a drone to check. And that's the footage that we see, where you have Sinwar basically, crouched, covered in dust, looking pretty weak, trying to knock down this drone with a stick. At that point, the Israelis realize he's still alive. They call in tank fire. So at this point, it's not exactly clear what kills Sinwar. It may be a tank shell. It may be the gun on a tank. It may be the bullets of the Israeli soldiers opening fire, or a combination of everything. But essentially, next time they go and check with the drone, they kind of know he's dead. But by this point, it's getting dark. They realize they're supposed to clear the building to make sure that everything's all kind of, the people that they've engaged with, they know what the outcome of the battle was. But it's getting dark. So they basically turn in for the night, completely unaware of the seismic importance of what they've done. Bear in mind, there is no design to this operation. It is pure luck that they've ran into the most wanted man in Israel. And when they return the following morning, they look at the corpse and they realise it's Sinwar.
If you're enjoying this episode of The Story, you can listen to more by subscribing to the podcast. It's completely free, and we'll put a link below in the description box for different ways you can follow us. George, you were describing the final moments, the death of Yahya Sinwar, the most wanted man in Israel. Just tell us a bit about the man himself. What do we know about him? What was his background? How did he become the most wanted man in Israel? How did he become a leader in Hamas?
Well, we know quite a lot about him because he was cultivated from a young age to become a leader, really. He was there at the very inception of Hamas in the 1980s because he was the protege of a man called Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, who was the founder. He was the founding imam, and he was eventually assassinated by Israel like Sinwar. But he entrusted Sinwar, when Sinwar was still in his 20s, to lead the morality police, the Al-Majd, which was basically responsible for rooting out Israeli spies, but also kind of punishing supposed sins, things like fornication and homosexuality and drinking, all these sorts of stuff that kind of puritanical fundamentalists of Hamas disapproved of. What happened was that he was arrested by the Israelis, not first for killing any Israelis, but for killing Palestinians. And he confessed to the murder of 4 Palestinians who were supposed collaborators. This earned him a stint for 22 years in Israeli prison. And this is the real making of Sinwar, this period.
Tell us about that. What happens to him in prison?
Well, Sinwar, he could have, gone into a funk. He could have gone many different ways. But what he did is he used that time in prison to really study Jewish culture, and he learned fluent Hebrew, and he wrote a novel, and he read as much Israeli media as he could, watched as much Israeli TV, and, he said later in an interview, prison was the making of me. But he also, he commanded respect among the Hamas militants who were in jail. And bear in mind, at the time, there was a distinction between those who were the kind of religious figures of Palestinian resistance, and that's Hamas. They're the kind of radical Sunni ideology that fuels them more than anything else. And then you had the kind of more secular PLO traces that are still there. And I spoke to a man called Dr. Yuval Bitton. He was the dentist, actually, in one of those prisons. He said he could tell the difference between the two different types of Palestinian prisoner, because the PLO, they were kind of more libertines. They would indulge themselves in drink and smoking, and so their teeth were all yellowing and a bit wonky. And then the puritanical kind of religious ideologues of Hamas all had perfect teeth, Sinwar included.
How does he end up leaving prison?
Well, he's lucky to leave with his life, firstly, because he owes his life to Israeli surgeons who remove an abscess on his brain. It was Bitton, the dentist I was talking about, who identified his dizzy spells and realised he was suffering from a stroke, arranged for him to be transferred to a hospital. And these Jewish doctors essentially saved his life. And Sinwar acknowledged that debt to Bitton and tried to get Bitton's number when he was released. He was released in 2011 as part of an exchange deal negotiated under Benjamin Netanyahu's government, previous government of his, in which the soldier Gilad Shalit, who had been taken hostage in Gaza, was swapped for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners.
أعيش روح الجندي I'm still a soldier, and I will continue with my nephews on the battlefield. I have been absent for 25 years, so there are many things I need to learn. So I still need to evaluate all the facts and decide where I should be exactly.
And Sinwar himself was opposed to this deal. He was opposed to the deal that released him because he didn't think that they had driven a hard enough bargain, even though they were securing the release of over 1,000 prisoners. That gives you an insight into what a kind of single-minded, determined guy he was.
How does he go from the moment he's released from prison to being the military leader, effectively, of Hamas?
Well, he is both a scholar and a brute. You know, he understands Israel, he understands his sworn enemy, arguably better than anyone else in Hamas, but he's also a ruthless thug who, from his time in Al-Majd, is totally uncompromising in his treatment of his fellow Palestinians as much as Israelis. And so he rises up the ranks. Bear in mind, he's the anointed one almost from the time of Yassin. And so he becomes, like you say, the leader of Hamas in Gaza. And there's a political bureau abroad in Qatar, but basically they're a little bit cut out of what Hamas is in the day-to-day running of it. And so he is de facto the main man.
He's thought to have masterminded October the 7th. He's also seen as many as one of the problems in negotiating a peace ever since then.
Well, you know, like with the Gilad Shalit deal that he opposed, he is a hardliner. Bear in mind, there was a ceasefire deal. The overwhelming release of any hostages came from the ceasefire deal, but that may be because October the 7th, as far as Hamas was concerned, is almost too successful. They ended up with too many hostages. It was unmanageable. And, you know, Sinwar, in the accounts of those Israeli hostages who were released in that deal last year, was kind of went and visited them and was courteous. But they asked him, you know, have you no shame? And he basically said no. He also, you know, would have hoped that this would spark a regional war, and to a degree it has, but he would have wanted more from Hezbollah and from Iran from the get-go. If you go back to the interviews he gave, and he didn't give very many, but he did give one in 2018 to an Italian journalist, he said, the only way that we basically raise the Palestinian issue is through blood. And the quote he said was, no blood, no news. So as far as he was concerned, if you want to elevate, a price has to be paid regardless of the death toll, which is now over 42,000. As far as he was concerned, they needed to pay this sacrifice almost for the ultimate goal. But arguably, Hezbollah and Iran let him down. Yes, they've attacked Israel, but not to the same extent that he would have hoped.
What does Sinwar's death mean now for Hamas? They've obviously sort of suffered so many losses. Is there much of an infrastructure left? Do we know who takes over?
His brother is a likely candidate, Mohammed Sinwar, who is also believed to be in Gaza. He's pretty up there. They still have people in Qatar, but at the moment it's not clear. I mean, what you have is these kind of different units almost of Hamas across the Gaza Strip, and it's not clear to what extent they're working in a coordinated way with one another. Even when Sinwar was alive, it's not clear whether he was able to kind of give orders to create a united position, or if you just have kind of individual guerrilla kind of groups across this rubble-strewn landscape, you know, trying to inflict casualties on the Israeli troops as and where they can. So I think it's a question for the coming weeks as to whether not you'll see a kind of coherent approach from Hamas come out in negotiations.
And do you think this will sort of show, I mean, in terms of working out whether there is a structure, where there is enough of a body left for Hamas, do you think this is a moment that shows them as weakened, as almost defeated? Or is there a danger that, you know, as we talked about the battle of narratives at the start, that it sort of becomes a recruiting sergeant? It encourages more and more people to join up.
Well, the original Israeli war aims were twofold. The first one was to release the hostages, and they still haven't done that. There are still around 100 hostages there, of which a third are believed to be dead. So that's one thing. But the second thing was to defeat Hamas. And that's something that plenty of military figures have debated as to whether it's feasible at all. And the reason for that is that as much as you can kill as many Hamas fighters as possible, and there's no doubt that Israel has been very successful at doing that and has certainly taken its revenge in terms of killing all the commanders of October the 7th, fundamentally Hamas is just a radical Sunni ideology, and the degree to which that survives its leadership remains to be seen. But, it seems very plausible that it will.
When the news came in of Yahya Sinwar's death, there was an immediate response from a number of world leaders talking about this as a moment of hope for peace in the Middle East. Just tell us a bit about the reaction.
Well, for Biden, it was an important moment. Bear in mind, he's coming to the end of his presidency. He wants to secure his legacy. And he immediately tried to put pressure and use this as a moment to kind of make a renewed push for ceasefire talks, which have basically stalled.
The death of the leader of Hamas represents a moment of justice. He had the blood of Americans and Israelis, Palestinians and Germans and so many others on his hands. I told the Prime Minister of Israel yesterday, let's also make this moment an opportunity to seek a path to peace, a better future in Gaza without Hamas.
And Netanyahu, it must be said, when he gave his statement, saying, we've got Sinwar, this is a big moment, was immediately saying, we are continuing in Gaza and the job is not done.
As King David said, I will pursue my enemies and destroy them, and I will not return to their end. Citizens of Israel, we are in the resurrection war. Big challenges are still ahead of us. We are required for long patience, for the unity of the ranks, for courage, for a firm stand. Together we will fight, and with God's help, together we will win.
So he was trying to bat away that pressure that he kind of predicted would come onto him almost at the same time as announcing Sinwar's death. So at the moment, it doesn't feel like there's much momentum towards a ceasefire deal. I mean, that said, Shin Bet, which is the domestic intelligence agency in Israel, they've sent their chief to Cairo to restart negotiations. But with Sinwar's death, it's not really clear who they're negotiating with. And meanwhile, if you look at the opposite end of the spectrum in Israeli politics, you've got people like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's an extremist minister in Netanyahu's government. Even today, he's been on the border of Gaza calling for the resettlement of Gaza.
Just explain what that means, the resettlement of Gaza.
So that means basically doing what Israeli settlers have been doing in the West Bank, and Ben-Gvir is one of them, which is kicking out all the Palestinians who live there and absorbing it into the state of Israel. That's genuinely what Ben-Gvir says is his aim.
So that's part of the Israeli government wanting Gaza to be part of Israel again. George, for many in Israel, there are mixed views, but certainly for some in Israel, this could have been the moment you end the war. You've killed the leadership of Hamas. It hasn't ended. There has been more bombing, more civilians killed since Yahya Sinwar's death. Do we have any sense of what Benjamin Netanyahu's endgame is? Is it the same as ministers like Ben-Gvir? Is he hoping to bring Gaza back into Israeli territory? How does this end for him?
I think we've got to reflect on Netanyahu's own political position within Israel. He is in a coalition government. He fought very hard to make this coalition government. There were, I think, 4 elections in 5 years or 5 elections in 4 years. It was a kind of flurry of elections in Israeli politics before then. And he was out of power briefly. And he is not going to let go of that coalition easily, not least because it would probably mean political oblivion for him. So if he is to maintain his coalition, he has to appease those who are basically on the far right of Israeli politics, people like Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is the security minister. And these people have stated very clearly, in the case of Ben-Gvir, if we leave Gaza, I will collapse the government and leave your coalition. And now he's extended that to Lebanon as well. It must be said, Netanyahu has made steps to kind of broaden his coalition and strengthen his hand recently by basically accepting another party into it. So he could probably survive the loss of Ben-Gvir now, but he couldn't survive the loss of both Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So he domestically, to kind of appease that audience, needs to keep going.
That was George Grylls, defence correspondent for The Times, speaking to us from Tel Aviv, where he's currently covering the war. You can follow all of his latest reports at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Priyanka Deladia and Edward Drummond. The executive producer was Kate Ford. Sound design was by David Crackles and theme composition was by Mal Lassetto. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.